Hello, hello. My name is Shelby Hartman. I'm DoubleBlind's co-founder and editor-in-chief, and today I'm going to share with you a little bit about the current state of psychedelics. So this is a little bit of a different video than some of the other ones you've seen on our YouTube because I'm going to open up a little bit about some of my perspectives and some of the reasons why we do what we do at DoubleBlind. This is a really interesting and challenging moment in psychedelic history. So for those of you who don't know, there was sort of a first wave of psychedelic research and sort of the birth of the original psychedelic counterculture in the United States began around, well, the first research happened in the late 50s, actually. And then the counterculture movement sort of blossomed around it in the 60s and the 70s. And then in 1971, Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, which made a lot of the classic psychedelics like mushrooms and LSD federally illegal. And after that, psychedelic research basically got shut down for decades in the United States. There had been thousands of studies that were done, prior to 1971 that were looking at the promise of psilocybin, the primary psychoactive compound in psychedelic mushrooms, and also LSD for a number of the mental health conditions that those substances are showing promise for today. So alcohol dependence, nicotine dependence, for occasioning or causing mystical experiences or some kind of connection to the divine, depression, anxiety, what we sometimes refer to as end-of-life distress, which is sort of the distress that someone can feel if they have a terminal illness or if they're nearing the end of their life. A lot of that data just isn't considered rigorous enough by the FDA. It didn't follow certain standards, sample sizes weren't big enough, whatever it might be. But there was a ton of research that was happening decades ago, and then it got shut down in a big way. And then it wasn't until sort of the late 90s, one of the first studies that was approved by the FDA was a study led by Rick Strassman in New Mexico investigating DMT. And then in the early 2000s, really sort of some people mark this as the beginning of the psychedelic renaissance. There was a study that was approved at Johns Hopkins University looking at psilocybin. And I can't remember if the first study that was approved was psilocybin for end-of-life distress in terminal patients or it was psilocybin for mystical experiences. But basically there was a few studies that were approved in the early 2000s, and Roland Griffiths, sort of this legendary researcher who had been well respected for studies in other fields outside of psychedelics, was the principal investigator on a lot of this research. Unfortunately, he passed this year. And that was sort of the beginning of the Western medical community and even the media. Like there was a big article that came out about that research in the New Yorker written by Michael Pollan called The Trip Treatment, which ultimately laid the foundation for his New York Times bestselling book, How to Change Your Mind, that led sort of the institutions that be in our culture to start taking psychedelics seriously as a therapeutic treatment. Now, why am I telling you all of this? If you're still listening, I'm telling you all of this because so much has changed so rapidly in recent years as it pertains to psychedelics and the psychedelic industry. Like, the psychedelic industry didn't even really exist 7 years ago. When I had the idea for DoubleBlind, it was November of 2018, and I was sitting in my apartment in New Orleans meditating, and I just got this beam of clarity that I wanted to start a print magazine on psychedelics. And it wasn't this strategic business decision Denver might soon decriminalize psilocybin and look at all of this renewed interest in psychedelic research, as is the case oftentimes with, thoughts that feel like revelations. The idea was simply, I want to start a magazine on psychedelics. And it just felt true and it felt right. And called up a bunch of friends who were journalists and asked them if they wanted to help out. And I don't have money and I don't know where it's going to go, but do you want to help out? And we put our first magazine into the world in May or June of 2019. But I remember we went to print the day after Denver became the first city in the United States to decriminalize psilocybin. And no one thought that that was going to pass. Like, I remember covering that. I have a background in journalism. I came from a history of, sort of breaking news. I started my career at CBS News. And so I had a history of following elections. And I was watching those votes come in, and it was so close. There were even, I think, some mainstream media outlets, like, don't quote me on it, but I think it was like places like CNN, CBS, that said that the initiative hadn't passed. And I was like, whoa, let's wait to call it, because like there's still some, votes that are trickling in, and it passed, and people were just amazed. And then from there, the decriminalization movement really spread like wildfire across the country. Less than a month later, Oakland became the first city to not just decriminalize psilocybin, but all natural psychedelics through an initiative called Decriminalize Nature. Basically anything that comes from the earth that is psychedelic. Then a bunch of different cities and counties followed in the footsteps of Oakland and decriminalized all natural psychedelics too, except for some of these places decided to exclude peyote at the request of the Native American Church, because peyote is at risk of becoming endangered, and the Native American Church has requested that people who don't have an ancestral tie to peyote don't consume peyote at this time. And if you're, just for the record, if you're interested in having an experience with a mescaline-containing cacti, then San Pedro is a good alternative. Yeah, now there's so many, more than a dozen places have decriminalized all natural psychedelics. Seattle, San Francisco, I'm going to forget all the names, but we've been covering this closely on the DoubleBlind website, following all the various places that have introduced initiatives, and some of these initiatives have passed at the ballot box, and some of them have passed through city council. Simultaneously, alongside this decriminalization movement, which is really happening at the grassroots level by activists and volunteers who just really, really care about psychedelics and believe in their healing potential and don't think that anyone should be arrested or criminalized for the possession of psychedelics, we're continuing to see a growth on the research side and on the drug development side, whereby hundreds of millions of dollars have been invested in putting various psychedelics through the FDA approval process to become medicines, basically, that can be prescribed by your doctor. And there's a lot of controversy around this. Firstly, there's concern about accessibility, which is fair because the pharmaceutical industry doesn't have a great track record of prioritizing accessibility and care over profit. Secondly, there's concern about the commodification of plant medicines that have been used for thousands of years by indigenous communities. So there's some companies that have tried to do things like create a synthetic mescaline, which obviously mescaline is the primary psychoactive ingredient in peyote and San Pedro and other indigenous medicines, without giving back to those communities. There's concern about the over-medicalization of psychedelics. So, plant medicines have been used for thousands of years in sacred ceremonial contexts. There are shamans and healers who believe that you can't just pluck the psychedelic out of its environment and it's going to have the same therapeutic effects, that mushrooms, for example, are sacred and that they are animate beings that should be taken with respect around a fire, the way they have been for a long, long time. And particularly a lot of people who have been following, the psychedelic movement for some time are concerned about seeing a repeat of what we saw in cannabis happen in psychedelics, whereby there was so much emphasis on sort of reversing the stigma and the taboo around cannabis that in some ways it was sterilized, and that the culture that actually in a lot of ways was very rich and beautiful that surrounded cannabis was diminished, and that it was instead sort of marketed as this therapeutic tool for veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder and cancer patients who have nausea who are going through chemotherapy. I am not diminishing the importance and potential of psychedelics and cannabis some of which people say is a psychedelic, for people who are truly suffering. But I am saying that these plants and these fungi come from biocultural frameworks, right? Like earth and peoples that that later in this video, but two of the main ways being decriminalization, activists who are working at the grassroots level to change local law around the possession and growing and gifting of psychedelics, not the sale, but the gifting of psychedelics, and drug development, i.e. drug development companies, most of which are for profit, but some of which are nonprofit, trying to get psychedelics through the FDA approval process as medicines. In cannabis, what we saw is that a lot of people understood decriminalization, which basically means it's not legal, but you also can't be incarcerated for the possession of this thing, as the first step towards legalization. So it's like, first we're going to decriminalize cannabis, then we're going to legalize it medically, because it's always easier, especially through storytelling and PR, to kind of get the general public on board with the idea of legalizing something for people who really need it, which is fair. And then recreational legalization, right? Adult use. In psychedelics, we're actually seeing a tension between efforts to decriminalize and efforts to medicalize through the FDA. There are a lot of activists who are actually anti-legalization because they are concerned that once these psychedelics become legalized, that the government's going to be involved, right? With regulation and taxes and packaging and branding and all these things that, can basically change the medicines themselves. They can affect accessibility. What we've seen in California is that there's so much regulation around cannabis, right? With like the child-proof packaging and all the licenses and things that people have to get in order to be able to grow it and distribute it and sell it, that the price of legal cannabis has gone through the roof. And a lot of people have actually gone back to purchasing cannabis on the black market. Meanwhile, a lot of the people who actually put their lives on the line to legalize, to provide cannabis before it was legal, people, all across California, but many of them being concentrated in what we refer to as the Emerald Triangle, which is in Northern California, Humboldt County, and two other counties that I'm forgetting the names of, were locked out. They had for decades been growing weed and just like gifting it or selling it to people who really needed it, and they weren't able to compete in the legal market because they didn't have the resources to navigate all of the bureaucracy. And so a lot of the activists within the decriminalization movement are saying, like, let's just decriminalize, and people can gift psychedelics within community. At DoubleBlind, we're committed to covering it, and we're also simultaneously committed to supporting people on their journey with plant medicines if that's something that they feel called to do. For us, we don't understand psychedelics as just a tool for individual mental health or personal growth, right? Like there's a lot of emphasis in the psychedelic community about psilocybin for depression, MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. It's true that psychedelics have shown promise for disrupting our mental health epidemic, and there's a lot of people out there who need help, and we are absolutely in favor of the reduction of suffering. And it's our belief that when a person begins to heal themselves, that it also enables them to have more capacity to show up for other people and to be more conscientious global citizens. And when you begin to understand how a lot of plant medicines are perceived within an indigenous framework, there isn't a separation between me and we and the territories and the ancestors and the entire environment that surrounds these plants and these fungi. That's a very sort of Western framework, this sort of framework of the individual, that I am taking this thing to heal myself so that I can be happier. And so I'm not going to sit here and say psychedelics are going to save the world. They're the answer to all of our problems. I definitely don't think that. I understand that we're living in a really challenging moment and that a lot of people are suffering as a result of systems that are in place that like fundamentally need to be changed, right? But psychedelics may be one tool. I'm not going to say they can be, but that they may be one powerful tool for beginning to catalyze internal change, which can then sort of have a ripple effect throughout our culture. And that's really what we're trying to do at DoubleBlind. And also recognizing DoubleBlind is one very small piece of the puzzle, right? That we're standing on the shoulders of giants. We're standing on the shoulders of all of the indigenous people that have literally preserved the knowledge around these medicines for thousands of years in the face of persecution, not just for using these medicines, but for simply existing. And, you know, we talk a lot in the psychedelic community about indigenous reciprocity and indigenous stewardship and what does it mean to give back to indigenous people who have preserved the knowledge around these medicines. And it's important to remember that a lot of indigenous communities around the world are actually just still struggling to survive and to preserve their territories, facing, you know, communities in the Amazon facing foreign oil and mining extraction. I mean, people just actually struggling to survive in the face of dictatorial governments that don't want them to exist. So if you're interested in learning more about that, we've also written about it on DoubleBlind, and we have a number of organizations that we work with and we donate to every single month that are Indigenous led. And that's something that really is very important to us. So you can drop a comment below this video and we'll send you some resources and things about how you can help and how you can support. You know, and then of course, in terms of, you know, speaking of the giants, you know, the shoulders of giants that we're standing on, not just the indigenous peoples, although they're a huge, huge part of this, but also all of the underground facilitators that are continuing to put their lives on the line to help people heal now. Because we don't know how long it's going to take until psychedelics are decriminalized across the United States, or, you know, psilocybin and MDMA are legalized through the FDA, probably in the next 5 years. But there's so many unknowns, right? Like even if psilocybin, I'm going to say when psilocybin becomes legalized and MDMA becomes legalized as prescription medications that you can get through your doctor, it's not like everyone's going to be able to just go to the doctor and get psilocybin and MDMA. I mean, they're going to be approved for particular conditions. So psilocybin will likely first be approved for either treatment-resistant depression or major depressive disorder, but depression. And MDMA is likely going to be legalized for post-traumatic stress disorder. So if you don't have one of those conditions and you want access to this therapy, there's a lot of unknowns about what that's going to look like. Are you going to be able to access it through something called off-label treatment? Is it going to be covered by your insurance? Even if you do have one of these conditions and it's covered by your insurance, how much is it going to cost? What's the process going to look like? And hey, what about all the people who don't want to do psychedelics on a couch with a blindfold and two therapists? Like, is that okay? So there's a lot more to say about this, but I just wanted to come on and share a little bit about what's alive for me in my heart and my mind. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you're interested in more videos like this, subscribe to our YouTube channel or check us out at doubleblindmag.com.